The notice was nailed to her door on October 28, 1876. It was a single sheet of paper, already curling in the autumn damp, its legalistic pronouncements stark against the weathered pine. The words were a verdict, delivered by the Prairie States Bank and Trust, an institution as remote and unfeeling as the winter sky. It declared that the property, a meager shack and the quarter-acre of stony ground upon which it sat, was forfeit. The debt was her late husband's, a small loan for mining equipment that had been buried with him a year prior. The interest, however, had survived. Elara Vance read the words without emotion. Grief had scoured her clean of tears long ago. All that remained was a quiet, unyielding core of resolve, forged in the crucible of loss. She was 15 years old. She had been a wife for 11 months and a widow for 12. Her parents were gone, taken by consumption when she was a child, leaving her in the care of a grandfather who had filled her head with what the townsfolk called unsettled notions. He had taught her the language of the seasons, the architecture of a bird's nest, and the thermodynamics of the earth itself. He spoke of ancient ways, of structures that did not fight the wind, but yielded to it, of shelters that drew warmth from the deep ground rather than burning precious wood to stave off a cold that always won. When he died, he had left her with this knowledge and $47 in silver coins sewn into the hem of her dress. It was all she had. The town of Providence, nestled in a fold of the Great Plains, operated on a rigid and unforgiving calculus of its own. It valued industry, piety, and conformity above all else. A 15-year-old widow, possessing neither family nor fortune, was an anomaly, a problem to be managed. That management fell to the town council, a body of 4 men who met every Tuesday in the back room of the Mercantile. Elara stood before them that evening, a small, still figure in a homespun brown dress. The room smelled of pipe tobacco, leather, and condescension. Thaddeus Blackwood, the bank president and council chairman, presided. He was a man whose considerable physical bulk was matched only by the weight of his self-regard. Beside him sat Reverend Miller, whose piety was a weapon. Mr. Croft, the mercantile owner, who measured every soul by their line of credit, and Sheriff Brody, a man who enforced the town's will with a weary disinterest. "Miss Vance," Blackwood began, his voice a low rumble of practiced authority. "We are, of course, sympathetic to your plight. Your husband was a hard worker, a tragedy. However, the bank is a business. The debt is clear." "I am not here to dispute the debt, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said. Her voice was steady, clear, and devoid of the pleading they expected. "The house is yours. I am here to request permission to build a new shelter for myself on the commons, on the unused parcel at the north edge of town." Mr. Croft leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "Build with what, girl? You have no funds. The town cannot be expected to subsidize the construction of a new home. We have a fund for the indigent, of course. A room at the boarding house, perhaps, in exchange for laundry services?" "I will not be a charity case," Elara stated, her chin rising a fraction. "I have my own funds for materials, and I will build it myself." A murmur of amusement passed between the men. Reverend Miller steepled his fingers, a look of paternalistic pity on his face. "Child, building a house is men's work. It requires milled lumber, brick, iron stoves. These are expensive things. What sort of shelter could you possibly construct that would withstand a prairie winter?" This was the moment. Elara had rehearsed it, not the words, but the conviction behind them. "I will build a haystack house," she said. Silence. Not a respectful silence, but a void filled with disbelief, which quickly curdled into ridicule. Sheriff Brody coughed to hide a laugh. Blackwood stared at her as if she had just confessed to witchcraft. "A haystack House? Croft repeated, drawing the words out as if they were a foreign absurdity. You mean to live in a pile of grass like some field mouse? It is an ancient design, Ilara explained, her tone becoming didactic, as if addressing slow-witted children. My grandfather learned of it from the old countries. It is not a pile, but a structure. It begins with a pit to draw heat from the earth. A central post and wooden frame provide the shape. The hay, when properly stacked and compressed to a thickness of 4 feet, provides insulation far superior to a foot of solid wood. It will be warmer and stronger against the wind than any house in this town. Thaddeus Blackwood threw his head back and laughed. It was a full-throated, booming sound that filled the small room and crushed the air. The girl's grief has addled her mind, he declared to the others, who joined in with knowing chuckles. A house of hay! The first spark from a chimney would send it up in flames. The first heavy snow would collapse it. The wolves would burrow right through it. It is the single most foolish idea I have ever heard. There is a way to treat the exterior with a clay slurry to make it fire retardant, Ilara countered, her voice unwavering. The conical shape is designed to shed snow, and the weight only serves to compress the hay further, increasing its insulating properties. And no wolf can get through a 4-foot wall of densely packed grass and ice. Her precision only fueled their mockery. They saw it not as knowledge, but as the intricate fantasy of a broken mind. Yet, her request presented them with a perfect solution. Granting her the worthless patch of land on the commons would be a public act of charity, costing them nothing. Her inevitable, spectacular failure would serve as a cautionary tale against foolishness and nonconformity. When her hay house collapsed, she would be humbled, broken, and ready to accept the laundry work and the charity they offered. Very well, Miss Vance, Blackwood said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He made a grand gesture of magnanimity. The council grants your request. You may use the barren ground north of the creek. Let it not be said that the town of Providence is without compassion. But when this folly of yours fails, do not come to us complaining of the cold. I will not, Ilara said. She turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, leaving the 4 men to their self-satisfied laughter. The first frost of the season was already glazing the boardwalks. Winter was coming. She had work to do. On the first day of November, 1876, Ilara began. The land they had given her was precisely as they had described it. Barren. It was a shallow, wind-swept slope, littered with stones and shunned by the good grazing grass. But Ilara saw it differently. She did not see a barren plot. She saw a south-facing aspect. The gentle slope would provide excellent drainage. A thick copse of pine trees to the north formed a natural windbreak, a crucial element her grandfather had stressed. The sun, even in its low winter arc, would grace the front of her dwelling for the maximum number of hours each day. The men of Providence saw wasteland. Ilara saw a perfect location. Her first task was the most grueling. It was the foundation, not of wood or stone, but of absence. She was to dig a hole. This was the principle of the pit house, the walipini, a concept so old it felt like a memory in her bones. The earth itself was the ultimate building material, a vast thermal battery that stored the latent heat of the sun. To go down into the ground was to retreat from the killing cold of the air. She marked out a rectangle on the hard soil, its dimensions precise in her mind. It would be 12 feet wide and 16 feet long. She took up the pickaxe and spade her husband had left behind and swung the heavy tool into the earth. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on her small frame. The topsoil was thin, giving way to a dense, clay-like substrate interwoven with a web of ancient roots and stones. Each swing of the pickaxe jarred her arms and shoulders. Each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last. The townspeople watched from a distance. Women on their way back from the mercantile would pause, whispering to each other, shaking their heads at the sight of the lone girl toiling in a hole in the ground. Men riding by would sometimes shout jests. "Diggin' your own grave, missy? Saves the rest of us the trouble." She never looked up. She never responded. Her world had shrunk to the next swing, the next shovelful, the rhythm of exertion and the slow, satisfying deepening of the earth. She worked from the first light of dawn until the purple twilight made it impossible to see. Her hands, soft from a year of domestic quiet, blistered, then broke, then bled. She tore strips from an old shirt to wrap them, the rough cloth a poor substitute for proper gloves. At night, she collapsed in the cold shell of her old shack, which the bank had allowed her to occupy for a few more days, her muscles screaming in protest. She ate little, a bit of bread, some dried apples, saving her money for the materials that mattered. Every evening she would clean her tools with an almost religious reverence. They were her partners in this endeavor, extensions of her will. Over 10 days, the hole took shape. It was a work of careful engineering, not just a simple pit. The northern wall was the deepest, descending a full 6 feet. From there, the floor sloped gently upwards to the southern end, which was only 4 feet deep. This subtle incline was crucial. It would allow the low winter sun to penetrate the entire length of the interior space once the south-facing glazing was in place. Though for now, she knew she could not afford glass. The excavated earth was not discarded. She piled it carefully to the north, west, and east of the pit, creating thick, insulating berms that would further shield her home from the wind and cold. The southern edge she left clear. Once the excavation was complete, she spent 2 days lining the floor. She hauled dozens of smooth, flat stones from the nearby creek bed, piecing them together like a mosaic over a bed of sand for drainage. This was labor, not currency. The resulting floor was uneven but solid, a barrier against the dampness of the deep earth. Standing in the completed pit, the wind passed harmlessly over her head. The air at the bottom was already several degrees warmer than the air at the surface. The first part of her grandfather's wisdom had proven true. The earth was a reservoir of warmth. The cost of this foundation, which was more stable and thermally efficient than any in Providence, had been nothing more than sweat and determination. The next phase required wood. She had no money for the clean, straight planks at Croft's Mercantile. Her forest was the tangle of woods beyond the commons, and her lumber was the deadfall the loggers left behind. For a week, she became a scavenger, searching for pine and birch logs that were straight, strong, and not yet riddled with rot. She found a magnificent pine, felled by a lightning strike years ago, its trunk a solid 15 feet of raw potential. It was far too heavy to move in one piece. Using a small handsaw and wedges, she spent 2 agonizing days sectioning it. The most important piece was the central post, the heart of the structure. It was a 10-foot section, thick as a man's chest, that she laboriously stripped of its bark. Getting the post into the center of the pit was a monumental challenge of leverage and ingenuity. She dug a 3-foot deep hole in the center of the stone floor. Then, using a combination of smaller logs as rollers and a makeshift ramp, she painstakingly maneuvered the massive timber to the edge of the pit and, with a final, desperate push, tipped it in. It landed with a ground-shaking thud. With a pry bar and sheer grit, she wrestled the base of the post into its hole, then used ropes to haul it into a vertical position. She spent the rest of the day packing rocks and hard earth into the hole around its base until it stood as firm and immovable as a mountain. It rose 7 feet above the floor of the pit, a central pillar from which the entire roof would radiate. The rest of the framework was a lattice of smaller logs. She laid a sill plate of half logs along the earthen ledge at the top of the pit. From this perimeter, she ran rafters up to the peak of the central post, creating the conical skeleton of her roof. There were no iron nails in her construction. Her grandfather had taught her the old ways. At each joint, she painstakingly drilled holes with a hand auger and pounded in tapered wooden pegs, or dowels, that she had whittled from branches of ironwood. She lashed other joints together with jute rope, which she had purchased for 62 cents. The process was slow and demanded precision. A single weak joint could compromise the entire structure. The resulting frame looked primitive, almost animalistic, like the skeleton of some great beast half buried in the earth. To the townsfolk, it was further proof of her madness. To Alara, it was beautiful. It was the promise of shelter. Now came the most crucial and most misunderstood part of her plan: the hay. Thaddeus Blackwood and the others imagined a loose pile of fodder, flammable and flimsy. They had no concept of what she was about to do. She walked the 5 miles to the Abernathy farm. Old Man Abernathy was a Quaker, a man who saw the world with kinder eyes than the council. He listened to her plan not with ridicule, but with a quiet, thoughtful curiosity. "My father spoke of such things in the old country," he said, stroking his white beard. "Houses of turf and thatch. They lasted generations." He could not sell her his prime Timothy hay. His livestock depended on it, but he had several tons of last year's surplus, packed tight and dry in the barn. He also had a massive stack of slough grass, a coarse, tough sedge he cut from the wetlands to keep them from overgrowing. It was no good for his cattle, but its high silica content made it remarkably water-resistant and slow to rot. He looked at the small, determined girl before him, at the calluses on her hands, and made a decision. He sold her the entire lot, more than she could possibly need, for $27. It was almost all the money she had left. He even agreed to have his son deliver it by wagon, a gesture of kindness she had not expected. The arrival of the hay wagons in Providence caused a minor spectacle. 3 massive loads of what the town considered cattle feed were deposited next to Alara's hole. The finality of her foolishness was now on public display. Blackwood made a point of walking past that afternoon. "A fine delivery, Miss Vance," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I trust the mice and crickets will find it to their liking. Do be careful with your lantern." Alara simply nodded and began her work. This was not construction. It was weaving. It was sculpture. She started from the base, laying the coarse, water-resistant slough grass directly against the wooden frame. She did not simply place it. She laid it in thick, interlocking bundles, their stalks oriented downwards and outwards to shed water. After laying a foot-thick course, she would climb onto it, walking back and forth, using her own weight to compress it. Then she would sprinkle it with a small amount of water from the creek, not enough to soak it, but just enough to make the stalks pliable and encourage them to settle into a dense, semi-solid mass. Layer by painstaking layer, the walls grew. She worked from the outside in. First, the thick layer of slough grass, then a much thicker layer of the drier, fluffier Timothy hay. It was the Timothy hay that provided the bulk of the insulation. Its hollow stalks trapped millions of microscopic pockets of air. This stationary air was the true secret. It was not the grass itself that insulated, but the air it held captive. Her grandfather's lessons echoed in her mind. A house should wear a winter coat, child, not just a thin shirt. The walls of her house would be a coat 4 feet thick. She built the walls up and over the conical roof frame, constantly packing, compressing, and shaping. The structure slowly transformed from a wooden skeleton into a great, shaggy mound, a feature of the landscape itself. It was low to the ground, its peak no more than 4 feet above the surrounding berm, presenting a minimal profile to the punishing prairie winds. She left only a few openings. On the south side, a low, tunnel-like entrance framed with stout logs. At the peak, next to the central post, she built a small, square chimney, carefully framed in wood, but lined with flat stones mortared with clay. This was for ventilation and for the smoke from her small stove. Creating a safe passage for fire through a wall of hay was the most dangerous part of the design, and she took immense care, ensuring a thick, non-combustible barrier separated the hot flue from the dry grass. Her final major purchase was a single, large canvas tarp from Croft's Mercantile. It cost her $3. This she stretched and secured over the wooden frame of the south-facing wall, the one part of the pit that was not buried. It was a poor substitute for glass, admitting only a dim, filtered light, but it would block the wind and could be rolled up on sunny days. Eventually, she hoped to replace it with a real window. For now, it would have to do. The last step was to treat the exterior. She spent a day mixing a thick slurry of the native clay soil, water, and dried dung from Abernathy's farm. The dung acted as a fibrous binder, much like straw in adobe bricks. With her hands, she plastered this thick, gray mixture over the entire outer surface of the hay. It was messy, unpleasant work. But as the clay dried in the late autumn sun, it formed a hard, shell-like crust. It was not perfectly waterproof, but it would shed the rain and snow. More importantly, it was fire-resistant. A stray ember landing on this surface would smolder and die, unable to reach the dry hay within. On December 18, 1876, with the ground frozen solid and the sky the color of lead, Alara Vance moved into her new home. She carried her few possessions down the short entrance tunnel: a thin mattress, a trunk containing her grandfather's books and her husband's spare shirt, a cast-iron pot, and a few utensils. The $47 her grandfather had left her was now reduced to less than $9. The total cost of her home, a structure warmer and more resilient than any in town, had been $31 and change. The interior was small, dark, and smelled of earth, hay, and drying clay. The air was perfectly still and, to her profound relief, noticeably warmer than outside. The only light came from the dim glow through the canvas wall and from her small lantern. The space felt womb-like, a sanctuary carved from the world rather than built upon it. She set about making it a home. She used leftover timber to build a small bed frame, raising her mattress off the stone floor. In a corner, she constructed a tiny, efficient stove from scavenged bricks and a sheet of metal she had found near the abandoned mine. Its flue pipe, made from interlocking tin cans, ran up the stone-lined chimney. The fire she built within it was minuscule, fed by twigs and scavenged branches, yet it was astonishingly effective. The heat radiated through the small space, absorbed by the stone floor and the earthen walls, turning the entire structure into a gentle, radiant heater. She finished the interior walls not with wood, but with the same clay and dung plaster she had used outside. She applied it directly to the exposed earth of the pit walls, smoothing it with her hands. When it dried, it created a clean, hard surface that sealed out the dampness and prevented the walls from crumbling. It was a technique as old as civilization, and it transformed the rough-dug pit into a tidy, self-contained room. She felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Every part of this place was the work of her own hands, guided by wisdom that the world had deemed foolish. The town of Providence watched and waited for the inevitable failure. The Haystack House, or Vance's Folly as it became known, was a source of constant gossip and amusement. Children, emboldened by their parents' derision, would creep up and throw stones at the clay shell. Mr. Croft declared that the first heavy rain would turn it into a pile of mud and rot. Reverend Miller preached a sermon on the sin of pride, subtly alluding to the folly of a young woman who thought she knew better than the accumulated wisdom of her elders. Thaddeus Blackwood would often ride his horse to the edge of the commons and stare at the low, brown mound, a smug smile on his face. He was a man who enjoyed being right, and he was certain that nature itself would soon prove him so. The first true test came in early January. A snowstorm swept across the plains, burying the town in a foot of fine, dry powder. It was accompanied by a bitter cold that gnawed at the seams of the conventional wooden houses. The townsfolk stoked their stoves, the smoke from their chimneys pluming thick and black against the gray sky, a visible measure of the heat they were losing. In Blackwood's large, drafty house, the family huddled in the parlor, the only room they could keep tolerably warm, feeding cords of expensive oak into their great iron stove. In her pit house, Alara was comfortable. The small fire in her stove kept the interior at a steady 60 degrees. The most remarkable thing, however, was happening outside. While the roofs of every house in Providence showed dark patches where the heat from within was melting the snow, the roof of Alara's dwelling remained pristine, a perfect, unbroken blanket of white. The snow was not melting because no heat was escaping. It was a perfect demonstration of superior insulation. The townsfolk, however, interpreted this phenomenon through the lens of their own prejudice. "Look at that," Croft remarked to a customer in his store, pointing out the window. "The snow isn't melting. It must be as cold as a tomb in there. The poor girl's probably frozen solid." They saw proof of failure where there was, in fact, proof of stunning success. The dramatic irony was lost on everyone but Alara. She sat inside her warm, quiet shelter, reading one of her grandfather's books by lamplight, while the wind howled harmlessly overhead. The tons of snow piling on her roof were not a threat. They were a gift, another layer of insulation, free of charge, from the sky. January 22nd, 1877 began with an omen. The sun rose into a sky of a strange, yellowish-gray tint, and the air was unnaturally still and heavy. The old-timers felt a deep unease. They had seen skies like this before. By midday, the temperature had begun to plummet, dropping 20 degrees in a single hour. A thin, sharp wind picked up from the northwest, carrying the first stinging crystals of ice. This was not the preamble to a normal storm. This was something else entirely. By late afternoon, the world had vanished. The blizzard struck Providence not as a weather event, but as a physical assault. It was a white hurricane, a term used by the plains settlers for a storm of unimaginable ferocity. The wind did not just blow, it screamed, a solid wall of force that flattened fences and tore shingles from roofs. The snow was not composed of flakes, but of fine, hard granules, like sand, driven with such velocity that it scoured the paint from the sides of buildings and worked its way through the tiniest cracks in window frames and door jambs. Visibility dropped to zero. To step outside was to be instantly blinded and disoriented, the world reduced to a maelstrom of white noise and lethal cold. The people of Providence retreated into their homes, confident in their timber and nails. But their homes were built for a different kind of world. They were structures designed to stand tall, to defy the elements, and in doing so, they presented a broad target for the wind's fury. The wind found every imperfection. It forced the icy snow into attics and under doors. It rattled windows in their frames until the glass, made brittle by the intense cold, shattered, letting the blizzard itself into the house. The primary defense was the cast iron stove, but the stoves became voracious monsters. The cold leaching through the thin wooden walls was so profound that a stove at full roar could barely keep a single room above freezing. Families burned through their carefully rationed wood piles at a terrifying rate. Thaddeus Blackwood's house, the largest and most envied in town, became a trap. Its high gables and large glass windows, symbols of his prosperity, were now liabilities. The wind hammered the west-facing walls relentlessly. Sometime during the first night, a window in the upstairs bedroom exploded inward, and the storm took possession of the entire second floor. Blackwood nailed the door to the landing shut, but the cold could not be contained. It flowed down the stairs like a river of ice. His family, his wife Helen, and their two small children, a boy of 8 and a daughter of 6, were confined to the parlor. They fed the stove with split oak, then with fence posts from the back garden, and finally, with the very furniture of the house. A mahogany side table, a set of dining chairs, the boys' wooden toy chest. All were sacrificed to the fire. Still, the cold advanced. The temperature in the room hovered just above freezing. Frost began to form on the interior walls. Inside her shelter, Alara experienced the storm as a distant rumor. The screaming of the wind was muffled by 4 feet of hay and 6 feet of snow, reduced to a low, resonant hum, like the string of a giant cello being bowed. The structure did not shudder or groan. It was part of the earth, and the earth did not move. The tons of snow that buried her home completely were a blessing, a final, perfect layer of insulation that sealed her off from the world. Her tiny stove required only a handful of twigs every few hours to keep the ambient temperature at a comfortable, stable level. The air was fresh, drawn in through a small baffled intake pipe and vented through the chimney, a steady, silent circulation. She had a small store of dried meat, flour, and beans. She had water from a bucket of melted snow. She was not just surviving, she was living. She slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that the storm could rage for a week and she would remain untouched. The contrast between her state and the state of those who had mocked her was absolute. By the morning of the second day, the situation in the Blackwood house had become desperate. The last of the burnable furniture was gone. The fire in the stove sputtered and died, and the cold, which had been held at bay, flooded the room. The temperature plunged. Within an hour, their breath was fogging in the air. 6-year-old Sarah began to shiver uncontrollably, her lips turning a faint blue. Helen wrapped her in every blanket they owned, but it was like trying to shield a candle flame in a hurricane. The child's shivering subsided, replaced by a frightening lethargy. She was succumbing to the cold. Thaddeus Blackwood, a man defined by his pride and his certainty, was broken. He looked at his daughter, fading before his eyes, and at his wife, her face a mask of terror, and knew that his fine house was a tomb. His certainty had failed. His prosperity was meaningless. His pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only one place to go. The thought itself was a profound humiliation, a surrender so complete it sickened him. He would have to go to the girl. He would have to beg for shelter in the haystack. The journey was an act of near insane desperation. He wrapped his wife and children in layers of blankets and coats until they could barely move. He found Reverend Miller and his family in a similar state, their own home succumbing to the cold. Together, the two men who had led the chorus of ridicule against Alara prepared for the short, impossible trek. The distance to the commons was less than 300 yards, but it might as well have been 100 miles. When Blackwood opened his front door, the storm punched him in the chest. The force of the wind knocked him back, and the cold was a physical pain on his exposed skin. Tying a rope around his waist and giving the other end to the Reverend, he plunged into the white chaos. They moved by memory, unable to see more than a few feet. The snow was waist deep, a thick, grinding powder that resisted every step. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the children from their arms. It was a primal battle, man against an element that wanted him dead. They fell, they rose, they pushed forward, driven by the image of their freezing children. They almost missed it. The Haystack house was so completely buried that it had ceased to be a structure, becoming just another snowdrift in a landscape of drifts. What saved them was the chimney, a thin tendril of smoke, barely visible in the swirling snow, was being whipped away from the small stone vent. It was a sign of life, of warmth, of fire. They clawed their way through the snow to the south side of the mound, searching for the entrance tunnel. They found the canvas flap, frozen stiff and sealed with a barricade of snow. Blackwood pounded on it with his frozen fists, his shouts stolen by the wind. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the canvas was pulled aside from within. A small figure stood there, silhouetted by the warm, yellow light of a lantern. It was Alara. She looked at the snow-caked figures, at the desperation in Thaddeus Blackwood's eyes, at the small, limp bundle in his arms. She did not look surprised. She did not look triumphant. Her expression was one of calm, solemn acceptance. She said nothing. She simply stood aside and held the lantern high, beckoning them into the warmth. The moment they stumbled through the low entrance tunnel and into the main chamber, the change was so profound it felt like a passage into another world. The violent, deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly cut off, replaced by a profound, enveloping quiet. The brutal, invasive cold vanished, replaced by a wave of steady, radiant warmth that seemed to rise from the very floor and walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and warm earth. A small stove in the corner glowed with a comforting red light. A pot of soup simmered on its surface. Blackwood and Miller stood there, stunned into silence. Their families, half frozen and terrified, collapsed onto the floor, overwhelmed by the sudden reprieve. The interior was exactly as Blackwood had imagined it, small, earthen, primitive. But it was also something he had utterly failed to imagine. It was a sanctuary. It was life. The contrast between this humble, life-sustaining space and his own grand, deathly cold house was a revelation that stripped away the last of his pride. Alara moved with a quiet efficiency. She took the small, shivering form of Sarah from Blackwood's arms and carried her to the warmest spot by the stove. She unwrapped the frozen blankets, chafed the child's hands and feet, and spooned warm broth between her lips. She directed the others to remove their wet, frozen outer layers. She offered them soup in mismatched bowls. She spoke very little. There was no, "I told you so." There were no recriminations. Her actions were her vindication, more powerful than any words she could have spoken. In the face of their failure, she offered not scorn, but grace. And for the men who had mocked her, this quiet, unassuming act of mercy was the most humbling judgment of all. Within an hour, others arrived. The Crofts, Sheriff Brody and his wife, their own homes having failed them. Alara took them all in. The small space became crowded, but no one complained. They were alive. They huddled together in the hay-walled womb, listening to the storm rage impotently outside, saved by the profound and elemental wisdom of the girl they had called a fool. The blizzard raged for a third day before its fury finally abated. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind died, and a strange, brilliant silence fell over the plains. The sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of immense, sculpted snowdrifts under a sky of impossible blue. When the survivors emerged from Alara's shelter, they were met with a scene of devastation. The town of Providence was shattered. Several roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Countless windows were broken. But the true cost was measured in lives. 3 families living in isolated homesteads on the edge of town, unable to reach shelter, were found frozen in their homes. An elderly man who had tried to get to his woodshed had been found only 20 feet from his own back door. The town's confidence, its belief in the strength of its conventional structures and the rightness of its established ways, was buried under the same snow. The story of what had happened, of how the town's most prominent citizens had been saved in Vance's folly, spread faster than any wildfire. The low, snow-covered mound on the commons was no longer a symbol of foolishness. It was a monument to a wisdom that had been ignored. The men who had been its fiercest critics now became its most fervent advocates. Thaddeus Blackwood, a changed and humbled man, stood before a town meeting a week later. He publicly confessed his arrogance and his short-sightedness. He announced that the Prairie States Bank would fund the materials for a dozen more such shelters to be built on the commons for any family that needed one, and he would personally lead the construction efforts, under the direct supervision and instruction of Miss Elara Vance. Elara did not seek retribution, nor did she revel in her victory. Her vindication was quiet, residing in the simple fact of survival, in the proven truth of her grandfather's knowledge. She oversaw the construction of the new shelters, patiently teaching the men the methodical, ancient techniques of building with the earth and the harvest. She taught them not just how to build, but how to see the slope of the land, the direction of the wind, and the insulating power of the snow. The knowledge she possessed was not an invention. It was a memory. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who understood that survival depended not on defying nature, but on working in harmony with its fundamental principles. The laws of thermodynamics were older and more powerful than the bylaws of any town council. The tragedy of Providence was not the blizzard. It was the deafness of its leaders to a truth that had been offered freely. The real cost was measured in the lives that had been lost, not to the cold, but to the simple, stubborn pride of men who thought they knew better.